The late summer heat of 1889 did not just sit on the territory of Wyoming. It pressed down like a heavy, suffocating wool blanket in the town of Sweetwater Crossing. The air was a thick suspension of red dust and dry wind, carrying with it a scent that was confusing to the senses. It smelled of burnt sugar and coal smoke, a deceptive sweetness that tried and failed to mask the underlying reek of horse sweat, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of drying blood from the butcher's yard. Clara Wynne stood behind the high oak counter of the mercantile, her fingers stained with ink and the residue of ledger dust. She was 26 years old, a woman composed of sharp intelligence and soft curves that she did her best to hide beneath high-collared calico. She dipped the metal scoop into the barrel of brown sugar, the granules shifting with a sound like dry sand. 3 pounds. You said, Mrs. Gable? Clara asked, her voice steady, though her throat felt parched. The woman on the other side of the counter, the wife of the local blacksmith, nodded vigorously. 3 pounds. Clara, and put it on the account. My husband will settle it come Saturday. Clara watched the scale balance. She added a pinch more, watching the brass arm level out perfectly. That will be 45 cents. Mrs. Gable, I will mark it in the book. As the woman bustled out, the bell above the door jingled a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place in a town that seemed to be holding its breath. Clara opened the heavy ledger. Her pen scratched against the paper, recording the debt. 3 pounds of sugar, 45 cents. It was a mundane life on the surface, weighing flour, counting nails, measuring yards of gingham. But beneath the stiff fabric of her bodice, pressed tight against her skin where no one could see, sat a small, wrapped bundle of fabric. It was warm from her body heat, a constant, scratching reminder of why she could not sleep more than 3 hours a night. It was not just paper. It was a death warrant, or a salvation, depending on who found it first. Through the dust-streaked window, Clara looked out at the main street. Sweetwater Crossing was a town built on rumors and the railroad. The iron rails were creeping closer every week, slicing through the open range and the hunting grounds that had existed for centuries. With the railroad came money, and with money came men like Silas Crow. She saw him then. Silas Crow was sitting on the porch of the saloon across the street, his boots propped up on the railing. He was a man past 40, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and left out in the rain too long. He was whittling a stick with a knife that looked far too sharp for such idle work. Silas was a bounty hunter by trade, but lately he had become the right hand of the powerful land speculators pushing west. Clara shivered. Despite the heat, Silas had a way of looking at people that made them feel as though he were calculating their price per pound. He thrived on the fear he cultivated, turning neighbors against one another with whispered accusations and the jingle of silver coins. He was the reason the town felt like a powder keg waiting for a match. The door to the mercantile opened again, but this time the bell did not jingle cheerfully. It gave a dull thud as the door was pushed open with heavy deliberation. The light in the room seemed to dim as a tall figure stepped out of the blinding afternoon sun and into the shadow of the store. It was Jed Callahan. The town called him a cowboy, but the word felt too small for him. He worked for the Double Bar Ranch, riding the fence lines and managing the herd, but he moved with the silence of a man who had spent years trying not to be heard. He was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, with broad shoulders that carried the weight of the world without complaint. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes that were the color of flint, hard, gray, and unreadable. Clara felt a strange fluttering in her stomach, a sensation she ruthlessly suppressed. Jed rarely spoke more than was absolutely necessary. He had been an Army Scout once, years ago, before a tragedy that no one in town dared to speak of aloud had silenced him. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had decided he wanted no part of it, yet he remained tethered to this hard land. "Afternoon, Mr. Callahan," Clara said, straightening her spine. Jed tipped his hat, a barely perceptible motion. "Miss Wynne." His voice was low, like gravel shifting in a riverbed. He walked to the counter, placing a list written on a scrap of brown paper. "Boss needs these, and a tin of tobacco." Clara took the list. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, blocked and careful. 2 sacks of flour, 5 pounds of coffee beans, 1 box of 30-30 ammunition. "I will have the boy load the flour for you," Clara said, turning to the shelves to retrieve the coffee and ammunition. As she reached for the tin of tobacco, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a bruise on her wrist where she had knocked it against the woodpile that morning. It was nothing, but she felt Jed's eyes on it. When she turned back, he was looking at her wrist. He did not say a word, but his brow furrowed slightly, a crack in his stoic mask. "It is just a bruise, Mr. Callahan," she said softly, placing the tin on the counter. "I am clumsy in the mornings." Jed looked up at her eyes. For a second, the distance between them, the counter, the social station, the walls he built around himself seemed to vanish. He nodded once. "Careful, Miss Wynne. The world is hard enough without helping it hurt you." It was the most he had said to her in months. Clara felt a sudden, foolish urge to tell him everything, to pull the packet from her dress and slam it on the counter and say, "Help me." But she knew better. Jed Callahan hated violence. Everyone knew that. He carried a gun, but the town gossip said he had filed the firing pin down or removed it entirely, a penance for whatever sins haunted him. A man who would not shoot could not help her against a man like Silas Crow. "That will be $4.20, Clara said, forcing her voice back to professional detachment. Jed counted out the coins. 4 heavy silver dollars and 2 dimes. He placed them on the wood, not slapping them down like the other men, but setting them there with respect for their value. "Thank you," he said. He gathered his purchases, the box of ammunition disappearing into his coat pocket. He paused at the door, looking back at her. "A storm is coming. The air feels heavy." "It is just the dust, surely," Clara replied. "No," Jed said, looking past her, out the window toward the northern ridges. "Not dust, change." He left, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Clara moved to the window. She watched Jed load the flour onto his pack horse. As he tightened the cinch, her gaze drifted past him, up toward the ridge of the foothills that bordered the town. There, silhouetted against the burning red sky, was a rider on a spotted pony. It was Neol. She knew him by the way he sat his horse erect, proud, a part of the animal rather than a burden upon it. Neil was a warrior of the local tribe, a man of roughly 30 years who walked the razor's edge between the old ways and the encroaching destruction of his people. He was not allowed in the mercantile. He was barely tolerated on the street. But he was there, always watching. Clara had seen Neol 2 days ago, near the creek, when she had gone to wash her face and escape the heat. He had been watering his horse. He had not threatened her. He had simply looked at her with eyes that were dark and filled with a sorrow so deep it looked like anger. He knew the land was dying. He knew the fences were cutting off the migration paths. Silas Crow had seen Niall too, from across the street. Silas stood up from his chair. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the dusty boards and pointed a finger toward the ridge. "Look at him!" Silas shouted, his voice rasping loud enough for half the town to hear, sitting up there like a vulture, waiting to pick the bones of honest settlers. A few men loitering near the livery stable laughed, but it was a nervous, ugly sound. "We ought to teach them a lesson about boundaries," Silas continued, stepping off the porch. He patted the heavy Colt revolver on his hip. "Before they steal your cattle, or your women." Clara gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. It was the same old lie. The indigenous people were starving, their game driven off by the trains and the herds. Yet they were blamed for every missing calf and every bad season. It was Silas who stole. It was Silas and the land barons who altered deeds and burned fences to drive out the smallholders and the natives alike. She felt the crinkle of the paper against her skin again. The document she had found, quite by accident. in the bottom of a crate of ledger books sent from the territorial office. It was a map that showed water rights, a map that proved the valley where Niall's people camped, and where several poor homesteaders lived, had been legally designated as protected land until someone forged a new survey. Silas Crow was the enforcer of that forgery, and if he knew Clara had the original survey, he would not hesitate to kill her. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the town in shades of bruised purple and bloody orange. It was time to close. Clara locked the cash box, counting the day's take one last time. $12.65. A good day for the owner, a meaningless day for her. She extinguished the oil lamps, leaving the store in gloom. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, locking the heavy iron padlock behind her. The heat had not broken. If anything, the evening air was thicker, holding the day's warmth in the dust. She began the walk to her boarding house at the end of the street. She kept her head down, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders despite the temperature. Every shadow looked like Silas Crow. Every footstep sounded like a pursuer. As she passed the saloon, the doors swung open and a burst of piano music and raucous laughter spilled out. She saw Silas inside, holding court. He was holding up a bottle of whiskey, his face flushed. "To the future!" Silas roared. "A civilized country, cleaned of the savage and the weak." Clara hurried her pace, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock in her mind. She turned the corner onto the quieter lane where the boarding house stood. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the alleyway. Clara gasped, nearly stumbling, but the hand did not grab her. It steadied her. It was a firm, calloused grip on her elbow. She looked up in terror, expecting Silas or one of his drunks. It was Jed Callahan. He was standing in the shadows, his horse tethered quietly behind him. He had not left town yet. "Mr. Callahan," she breathed, her voice trembling. He released her elbow immediately, stepping back to give her space. He took off his hat, turning the brim in his hands. "You are walking fast, Miss Wynne, as if the devil is at your heels." "Perhaps he is," she whispered, the fear slipping out before she could check it. Jed looked at her, really looked at her, with those gray eyes that seemed to see everything she tried to hide. He glanced toward the saloon where Silas's laughter echoed into the night. "Crow is a loud dog," Jed said quietly. "But loud dogs bite." "I know," Clara said. "If you possess something that makes the dog bark," Jed said, his voice dropping so low she had to lean in to hear him, "you best be careful where you bury it." Clara froze. Did he know? How could he know? "I do not know what you mean," she lied, though her voice lacked conviction. Jed placed his hat back on his head, shadowing his eyes once more. "I was a scout. Ma'am, I learned to read signs. A woman does not clutch her chest to protect her heart from the heat. She clutches it to protect what is hidden there." Clara stared at him, stunned. "I am leaving for the ranch," Jed said, shifting his weight. "But I will be back in 2 days for more grain. If you need a heavy object moved or a path cleared." He trailed off, struggling with the words. He was offering help, but he did not know how to offer violence anymore. "Thank you, Jed," she said, using his first name for the first time. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and mounted his horse. He rode away into the deepening twilight, a solitary figure against the vast, darkening landscape. Clara watched him go. For a moment, the scent of the town changed. The coal smoke and the horse sweat faded. For just a second, she smelled sagebrush and rain, the scent of the open land. The scent of freedom. She turned and hurried into her boarding house, locking the door behind her. She went to her small room, lit a single candle, and drew the curtains tight. With trembling hands, she unbuttoned her dress and pulled out the cloth bundle. She unwrapped it. The paper was damp with her perspiration. She smoothed it out on the rough wood of her washstand. The ink was fading, but the seal of the territory was still visible. The signature at the bottom was clear. She was not just a bookkeeper. She was the keeper of the truth, and in Sweetwater Crossing, the truth was the most dangerous thing a person could hold. Outside, The wind picked up, rattling the window pane. It sounded like a scratching finger. Clara blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. She sat there, listening to the wind and the beating of her own heart, waiting for the fire that she knew was coming. The morning sun did not rise gently over Sweetwater Crossing. It broke the horizon like a cracked yoke, spilling heat and blinding light across the dusty streets before the church bell had even rung 6 times. 2 days had passed since Clara Wynne had first felt the weight of the hidden survey map against her ribs, and the tension in the town had pulled tight as a bowstring. Clara walked toward the mercantile, her basket hooked over her arm. The air was already stifling, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the acrid bite of something else, something charred. She told herself she was only going for a pound of sugar and a tin of tea leaves, the mundane errands of a life she was desperately trying to pretend she still owned. As she rounded the corner of the livery stable that bordered the mercantile's rear warehouse, she stopped dead. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sharp intake of dry air that tasted of ash. The double doors of the warehouse, usually smelling of raw pine and linseed oil, had been defaced, burned deep into the wood, the edges of the letters still smoking slightly from a brand applied in the dark hours of the morning, were 2 words that dripped with hatred: tribe lover. The smell of the scorched wood was fresh, pungent, and violent. But it was not the vandalism that made Clara's blood run cold. It was what, or rather, who was displayed beneath it. On the dusty ground of the loading dock, a young indigenous woman was kneeling. Her wrists were bound roughly with rawhide, tethered to the iron handle of the warehouse door. She could not have been more than 18 years old. Her head was bowed, her dark hair shielding her face, but the posture was one of enforced humiliation. She was being displayed like a trophy, or worse, a warning. A crowd had already gathered. It was a knot of men, mostly the unemployed drifters who followed the railroad expansion, mixed with a few respectable townsfolk who looked on with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Clara stepped closer, her heart hammering against the paper hidden in her bodice. She saw movement near the edge of the platform. It was Silas Crow. The bounty hunter looked entirely at ease. He leaned against a stack of crates, peeling an apple with a long-bladed knife, with a casual flick of his wrist. He tossed a silver coin to a man standing near the front of the crowd, a hulking laborer with the red-rimmed eyes of a heavy drinker. The laborer caught the coin, grinned, and turned to the crowd. "Look at her," he shouted, his voice slurring slightly. "Scouting for them. She was spying on honest folks so her kin can come thieve in the night." The crowd murmured, the sound growing louder, uglier. A clod of dirt flew from the back of the group and struck the girl's shoulder. She flinched, but did not cry out. "Stop it!" The words tore from Clara's throat before she could check them. She pushed through the outer ring of men, her basket knocking against denim-clad legs. "Stop it at once! She is a child!" The crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of surprise. Silas Crow stopped peeling his apple. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Clara. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, revealing teeth stained with tobacco. "Well, well," Silas said, pushing himself off the crates. He descended the short stairs of the dock, his spurs jingling with a musicality that sounded jarringly cheerful. "If it is not the lady of the ledgers, coming to check the inventory, Miss Wynne." "Unbind her, Silas," Clara said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to stand tall. "You have no authority to hold her here. If she has committed a crime, take her to the marshal." "The marshal is out riding the circuit," Silas drawled, stepping closer. He invaded her personal space, smelling of stale whiskey and gun oil. "And I am merely holding a witness. We found her lurking near the water tower. Sabotage, likely. She is wearing a berry-picking basket," Clara pointed out, gesturing to the crushed woven container kicked to the side. "She was gathering food." Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He leaned in, lowering his head until his brim touched hers. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift from public spectacle to private threat. "You have a sharp eye for details." "Clara," Silas whispered. His voice was a rasp, meant only for her. Just like you have a sharp eye for shipping manifests and catalogs, I recall you processed the paperwork for the Double Bar Ranch last month, and the survey office before that. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. A woman who reads that much, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a lethal murmur, might read things she was not meant to see, things that go missing, like a certain map of the valley. Clara instinctively pressed a hand to her chest, then dropped it immediately, realizing the mistake. Silas's eyes flickered to the movement. He knew. He did not just suspect. He knew she had something. "You look flushed. Miss Wynne," Silas said, loud enough for the crowd to hear now. "Perhaps you are carrying a burden too heavy for such a delicate thing. Perhaps you are hiding something for our friends in the hills." He reached out, his hand moving toward her shoulder, or perhaps lower, toward where the document lay hidden. "Get your hands off her." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a whip crack. Jed Callahan stood at the edge of the mob. He had abandoned his wagon in the street. He held a coil of rope in his left hand, and his right hand hung loose near his hip, not touching his gun, but close enough to serve as a reminder. Silas froze. He looked at Jed, assessing the threat. "This is town business. Callahan, go back to your cows. Abusing a girl and cornering a woman is not business," Jed said. He walked forward. The crowd, sensing the violence that coiled inside the quiet cowboy, parted like water around a stone. Jed stepped between Clara and Silas. He was taller than the bounty hunter, broader in the shoulders. He did not posture, he simply stood there, an immovable object. "Cut the girl loose, Silas," Jed said. "She is a spy." Silas spat. "She is scared," Jed corrected. "Cut her loose, or I will cut her loose, and I might be clumsy with my knife near your boots." For a long moment, the two men locked eyes. The heat of the morning seemed to intensify. Then, Silas laughed a short, barking sound. He waved a hand dismissively. "Let her go," Silas told the drunks. "She has served her purpose. We have seen who comes to her defense." He looked pointedly at Clara, as the laborer grudgingly sawed through the rawhide bindings. Jed gripped Clara's upper arm. His touch was firm, urgent. "We are leaving, now." "But the girl," Clara started. "She can run faster than you," Jed muttered, steering her away from the dock. The indigenous girl, once freed, did not wait. She scrambled to her feet and darted into the alleyway with the speed of a frightened deer. But before she vanished, she paused for a fraction of a second, looking back. Not at Jed, but at Clara. Clara turned her head, following the girl's line of sight, on the flat roof of the livery stable across the alley. A shadow detached itself from the chimney stack. It was Niall. He was crouched low, a rifle resting across his knees. He was not aiming for it, but his presence was undeniable. He had been watching the entire time. He had been ready to kill to save the girl, but to do so would have brought the wrath of the entire town down upon his people. He had waited, agonizingly, for an intervention. Neil's eyes met Clara's. The distance was 30 yards, but the connection was instantaneous. He saw her terror. He saw her defense of his kin, and he saw the way Silas Crow was looking at her back. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of a debt, and then melted back into the shadows of the roofline as if he had never been there. "Walk, Clara," Jed hissed in her ear. "Do not look up. Do not look back." He marched her down the street, away from the jeering crowd that Silas was now whipping back into a frenzy with promises of free drinks. Jed did not stop until they were around the corner, shielded by the bulk of the church. He released her arm. His face was pale beneath his tan, his jaw set hard. "He knows," Clara whispered, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "Jed, he knows I have the papers." "He suspects," Jed corrected, though he sounded unconvinced. "If he knew for sure, you would be dead in that alley. He is fishing. He is trying to make you panic so you reveal where it is. He threatened me. He said—" "I know what he is," Jed interrupted. "Listen to me. You cannot go back to the store. You cannot go back to work. You need to go to your room, pack a bag, and wait. Do not open the door for anyone but me. I have to secure the wagon and get my horse. I will be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Clara repeated. Go! Clara ran. She kept to the side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where the dust of the mob still hung in the air. She reached Mrs. Higgins' boarding house, her chest heaving, sweat trickling down her back. The front door was unlocked. As always, the hallway was cool and dim. Clara rushed up the stairs to number 4, her key fumbling in her hand. She did not need the key. The door to her room stood slightly ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, pale and jagged against the dark varnish. Clara stopped, her heart slamming against her ribs. She pushed the door open with a trembling hand. Her sanctuary had been violated. The mattress was overturned, its straw stuffing slashed and spilling out like entrails. The drawers of her small dresser had been pulled out and dumped on the floor, her modest undergarments and stockings trampled by muddy boots. The loose floorboard in the corner, the one she sometimes used to hide her small savings, had been pried up. They had been looking for the map. Clara stepped into the room. Stepping over a broken wash basin, they had not found it. The map was still warm against her skin, safely tucked inside her corset, but they had come close, too close. She moved to the small table by the window. It was the only thing still standing upright. In the center of the table sat a single object. It was a silver dollar, but it was not whole. 3 deep notches had been filed into the edge of the coin, and a hole had been punched through the center, a crude executioner's mark. In the lexicon of men like Silas Crow, it was a message clearer than any written note. Your price is paid. You are next. Clara stared at the coin, the metallic glint mocking her. Panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. She could not wait 20 minutes. She could not wait 10. She grabbed her carpetbag from the floor, shaking out the broken shards of her mirror. She shoved 2 dresses into it, her hands moving with frantic haste. She grabbed a box of matches, a small knife she used for fruit, and the heavy wool shawl from the hook. She had to run, but where if she took the road east? The telegraph wires would outrun her. If she went south, she would hit the desert. She heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Not the measured tread of Jed Callahan. These were hurried, heavy boots. 2 men, maybe 3. She came in just now, a voice shouted from the landing below. It was the landlady, Mrs. Higgins, sounding terrified. I saw her go up. Stand aside, woman! Silas Crow's voice boomed up the stairwell. Clara froze. He was here. He had not waited at the warehouse. She looked at the window. It was a 12-foot drop to the alley behind the boarding house. Below, a pile of discarded hay and refuse from the stables offered a questionable cushion. Clara did not hesitate. She threw the bag out the window, watching it land with a soft thud. She hiked up her skirts, straddled the sill, and pushed herself off just as the door to her room was kicked fully open. She hit the hay pile hard, the impact jarring her teeth and twisting her ankle. Pain shot up her leg, hot and instant, but adrenaline drowned it out. She rolled, scrambled to her feet, and grabbed her bag. There she goes, a voice shouted from the window above. A gunshot cracked, the bullet kicking up dirt 2 feet to her left. Clara ran. She limped, gasping for air, stumbling down the alleyway toward the edge of town, toward the only cover available, the dense brush of the creek bed. She could hear the shouts starting behind her. The hunt had begun. She reached the cover of the cottonwoods, her lungs burning. She crouched behind a fallen log, trying to still her breathing. From the main street, Silas Crow's voice carried over the wind, amplified by rage. $500, Silas bellowed. $500 and 2 good horses to the man who brings me the bookkeeper. She is a traitor. She is selling land secrets to the tribes. She is a thief and a liar. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy a farm, enough to make a good man hesitate, and a bad man kill without a second thought. She was alone. She was injured, and every gun in Sweetwater Crossing was now loaded for her. A twig snapped behind her. Clara spun around, raising her small fruit knife, a pitiful defense against the world. A hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her down into the dirt. "Quiet!" a voice hissed in her ear. She struggled, flailing, until the scent registered. Not whiskey, not stale tobacco, leather, horse, and saddle soap. Jed. He wrestled her into the hollow of the log, pressing her down into the leaves. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice barely a breath. "They are coming," Clara sobbed into his gloved hand. "Silas, the room—" "I know," Jed whispered. He removed his hand from her mouth but kept his arm over her, shielding her body with his own. He was looking through the brush, his gray eyes scanning the alleyway she had just fled. "I saw you jump," Jed said. "You have spirit. Clara Wynne, but you have no sense." "I have the map," she gasped, clutching her chest. "I have the proof. Jed, Silas burned the fences. He killed the surveyor. It is all here." Jed looked down at her. The revelation seemed to settle on him like a heavy coat. He closed his eyes for a second, a look of profound resignation crossing his scarred face. "Then you are a dead woman walking," he said softly. "Help me," she begged. "Please." Jed looked at his gun, the gun with the firing pin he had removed 5 years ago. The gun that was nothing more than a paperweight of steel. Then he looked at the distant line of men pouring out of the saloon, rifles in hand. He looked back at Clara. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but clear. She was not asking him to kill. She was asking him to let her live. "Damn it all," Jed breathed. He shifted, pulling a heavy canvas coat from his saddle roll that he had dragged into the brush with him. He threw it over her. "We cannot go back to my wagon," he said, his voice shifting into the clipped, professional tone of the scout he used to be. "They will be watching my horses. We have to move on foot until dark. Then we steal mounts." "Steal?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "You are an outlaw now." "Clara," Jed said, checking the horizon. $500 says so. Welcome to the other side of the law." He grabbed her hand, his grip rough but solid. "Can you run on that ankle?" Clara gritted her teeth, feeling the throb of pain. "I can run." "Then run," Jed said. "Run like the devil is chasing you. Because he is." They broke cover, heading not for the road, but for the dry riverbed that led up into the canyons, the hard land. The land where the town ended and the wilderness began. Behind them, the church bell began to toll, a frantic, rhythmic alarm that signaled fire or invasion. The conflict was locked. There was no going back to the ledger book and the sugar scoop. Clara pressed her arm against the sharp corners of the map hidden against her heart. It was just paper, ink, and wax. But as they scrambled up the shale slope, leaving civilization behind, she realized it was the heaviest thing she had ever carried. The climb out of the dry riverbed was a brutal introduction to the life of a fugitive. The shale crumbled under their boots, sliding away in miniature avalanches that sounded deafening in the silence of the afternoon. Clara Wynne gasped for air, her lungs burning with the effort, her injured ankle throbbing with a dull, rhythmic cadence that matched her heartbeat. Jed Callahan moved ahead of her, his movements economical and fluid. He did not scramble, he flowed over the rocks, finding footholds where there appeared to be none. Every 50 yards, he stopped and crouched, scanning the horizon beneath the brim of his hat, his gray eyes narrowing against the glare. He waited for her to catch up near a cluster of scrub oak. Clara collapsed against the rough bark, clutching her side. "We cannot stop here," Jed said, his voice flat. "We are still in the rifle range of the ridge." "I know," Clara wheezed, wiping a streak of dust and sweat from her forehead. I need a moment." Jed looked at her. The harsh sunlight was unforgiving, highlighting the terror in her eyes and the tremor in her hands. He looked down at the heavy Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He rested his hand on the walnut grip, a reflex born of habit, but his fingers did not curl around the trigger. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You said back there that Silas burned fences. You said he killed a surveyor. Do you know what you are saying? You are accusing the most powerful man's enforcement arm of murder. I am not just accusing him, Clara said, straightening up despite the pain. She pressed her hand against her bodice where the map lay hidden. I have the proof. If I stay, he kills me. If I run alone, he hunts me down. If you leave me, Jed, there will be blood on this ground before the sun sets. An innocent woman's blood. Jed looked away, toward the purple bruise of the distant mountains. I swore an oath. Clara, 5 years ago, I swore I would never point a weapon at a man with the intent to end his life again. I am not asking you to kill him, Clara said softly. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough canvas of his sleeve. I am asking you to keep me alive long enough for the truth to speak. Jed looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. The conflict behind his eyes was a storm front, dark and turbulent. He let out a long, ragged breath and nodded. We head for the cattle trails, he said. The decision made. The ground is harder there. It hides tracks better. But we have to cross the creek first. He drew his revolver. He spun the cylinder. It made a hollow clicking sound. He ejected the cylinder, showing her the empty space where the firing pin should have been. I can threaten, Jed said grimly. I can pistol whip, but this gun is nothing more than a 2-pound hammer. If they start shooting, we run. Do you understand? I understand, Clara whispered. They moved on, the sun beating down on their backs like a physical weight. They reached the edge of Painted Rock Creek an hour later. The water was low, a sluggish ribbon of brown cutting through the red earth, but the vegetation was thick with cottonwoods and willows. Jed held up a hand, signaling a halt. He dropped to one knee, listening. The sound of horses nickering drifted through the trees. Jed signaled for Clara to stay low. He crept forward, parting the willow branches with infinite care. Through the leaves, Clara saw them. 3 men. They were watering their horses. One of them was the hulking laborer from the warehouse, the one who had taken Silas's coin. They were armed with repeaters, looking relaxed but dangerous. They cut us off, Jed whispered, sliding back to her. They guessed we would head for water. What do we do? Clara asked, her voice barely audible. We created a ghost, Jed murmured. He uncoiled the lariat from his shoulder. He moved with a silent intensity, crawling through the brush to a position upstream from the men. Clara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jed found a loose cluster of deadfall timber perched precariously on the bank. He tied the rope to the central log, then looped the other end around a heavy boulder, creating a tension line. He picked up a handful of dry dirt and rocks. With a sudden, violent motion, he yanked the rope and threw the debris into the center of the brush pile. The crash was tremendous. The dead wood collapsed into the water with a splash that sounded like a falling horse, and the dust cloud puffed up like smoke. Hey! The laborer shouted, spinning around. The horses, spooked by the sudden noise and the flying debris, reared up. One tore its reins free and bolted downstream. The men shouted, cursing, their rifles swinging wildly toward the noise. Now, Jed said, grabbing Clara's hand. They broke cover, not running away from the men, but sprinting across the creek bed 50 yards downstream, using the chaos and the dust cloud as a screen. They splashed through the shallow water, the mud sucking at their boots. Over here I saw movement, one of the men yelled. A rifle cracked. The bullet whined through the air, stripping bark from a tree 5 feet above Clara's head. She cried out, stumbling, but Jed's grip on her hand was iron. He yanked her forward, dragging her up the opposite bank and into the dense scrub oak. They did not stop running for 2 miles. By the time the terrain began to rise into the foothills, the sun was sinking, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon floor. They were in the deep rock now, a labyrinth of red sandstone and narrow passes. They entered a box canyon, the walls rising 200 feet on either side. It was a dead end, but it offered shelter from the wind. We rest here for 5 minutes, Jed gasped, leaning against the canyon wall. He was soaked in sweat, his chest heaving. Clara slid down to sit on a flat rock. She was shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. They shot at us. They actually shot at us. Silas pays for results, Jed said, wiping his face with his bandana. He does not pay for excuses. A sound echoed from the mouth of the canyon. The click of a lever-action rifle being cocked. Jed spun around, his hand flying to his useless gun. Standing on a ledge 20 feet above them, silhouetted against the dying light, was Niall. The warrior held a Winchester rifle, the barrel pointed steadily at Jed's chest. He looked like a part of the stone, immovable and ancient. His long black hair moved slightly in the wind, but his body was statue still. "Hands away from the iron," Niall said. His English was clear, accented with the cadence of his own tongue. Jed slowly moved his hand away from his hip, raising his palms. "I have no quarrel with you, Niall. The cowboy always has a quarrel." Niall replied coolly. "You bring the dust, you bring the noise, and now you bring the bounty hunters to my doorstep." He shifted his gaze to Clara. "And you, the woman of the books, why do you run with the wolf who herds the cows?" Clara stood up, ignoring the pain in her ankle. She stepped in front of Jed, shielding him with her body. "We are not bringing them to you," Clara said, her voice ringing with a surprising strength. "We are trying to stop them." Niall lowered the rifle an inch, his dark eyes assessing her. "Stop them with what? A gun that does not shoot." He gestured to Jed's holster. "I watched you at the creek. You threw rocks like a child. A warrior shoots." Jed's jaw tightened. "I chose not to kill. There's a difference." "A dead man has no choices," Niall said. He jumped down from the ledge, landing silently on the canyon floor. He approached them, towering over Clara. "Do you carry it, the paper that steals the water?" Clara froze. "How do you know?" "I know the shape of lies," Niall said. "Silas Crow has been hunting for a paper. He burns the warehouse to hide his fear. He beats my kin to find a scapegoat. Show me." Jed stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Clara's shoulder. "Back off, Niall. She is exhausted." "And my people are thirsty," Niall snapped, turning on Jed. The two men stood chest to chest, the tension between them crackling like dried tinder. It was the clash of two worlds, the cowboy who fenced the land and the warrior who belonged to it. "Stop it, both of you," Clara shouted. She reached into her dress and pulled out the sweat-stained bundle. She unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers. "Here," she said, thrusting the papers at Niall. "Look at it. Just look at it." Niall took the papers. He did not read the words as a white man would. He scanned the lines, the map, the seals. He traced the line of the river with a calloused finger. "This line," Niall said, pointing to a jagged ink mark. "This is the cut where the Sweetwater flows. My grandfather camped there. The treaty said it was ours." "It is yours," Clara said. "This is the original survey from 1885. It marks the valley as protected territory. But look here." She pointed to a second sheet. "This is the transfer deed Silas Crow is trying to file. It claims the valley is dry land, unfit for habitation, and sells it to the railroad consortium for pennies." "And the water?" Jed asked, looking over Niall's shoulder. "They plan to dam it upstream," Clara explained, "to feed the steam engines and the new cattle yards. It will dry out everything below it, the farms, the tribe's camp, everything." Niall looked up, his face a mask of cold fury. "They steal the water to sell it back to us in barrels. Silas forged the signature of the territorial governor." Clara added, "If this gets to the federal court in Helena, the sale is void. Silas goes to prison. The land stays open." Jed let out a low whistle. 2 horses and $500. No wonder he wants you dead. You are carrying a stick of dynamite that could blow up his whole world." Niall handed the papers back to Clara with a newfound respect. "You carry a heavy burden. Woman of books." "My name is Clara," she said, tucking the bundle back into safety. "And I am Jed," the cowboy said, extending a hand. "I may herd cows, Niall, but I do not hold with thieves. We need to get her to Helena. Can you help us?" Niall looked at Jed's hand, then at his face. He did not shake the hand, but he nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. "The passes are watched. The road is dead. We must go high, above the timberline. That is a hard climb. Jed noted. The hawk does not fear the height, Neil said. Only the snake fears the climb. Come, the sky turns dark. The truce was struck. It was cold and fragile, held together only by Clara's presence and a mutual enemy. But it was a start. They moved deeper into the mountains as the daylight failed completely. The heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a biting chill that seeped into their bones. The sky, which had been clear, suddenly bruised with dark, rolling clouds. Storm, Jed muttered, looking up. Not dust this time. Rain. It began as a drizzle, then escalated within minutes to a torrential downpour. The dry earth could not drink the water fast enough. Rivulets of mud began to snake down the canyon walls. We must get higher, Neil shouted over the roar of the wind. The water comes fast in the narrow places. They scrambled up a steep incline of slick granite. The rain lashed at their faces, blinding them. Clara's skirts became heavy with water, dragging at her legs. She reached for a handhold, her fingers slipping on the wet stone. Clara, Jed yelled. She slid backward. Her boots lost purchase on the slime-covered rock. She fell, sliding toward the edge of a 10-foot drop into the churning mud below. Jed lunged. He did not think. He threw himself flat on the rock, his body sliding dangerously close to the edge. His hands shot out and clamped around Clara's wrist. The jolt nearly dislocated his shoulder. He grunted, his boots scrabbling for traction. I have got you, hold on. Neol was there a second later, grabbing Jed's belt to anchor him. Together, they heaved. Jed pulled Clara up and over the lip of the ledge. They collapsed in a heap, gasping, the rain pounding on them. Clara was shaking violently, her teeth chattering. I slipped. Jed sat up. He reached for her, his hands checking her for broken bones. Are you hurt, Clara? Look at me. I am cold, she whispered. So cold. Jed stripped off his heavy canvas coat. He ignored the freezing rain soaking his own shirt and wrapped the coat around her shoulders. He pulled the collar up to protect her neck. His hands lingered on the lapels of the coat, close to her face. He looked at her, his gray eyes wide with the terror of almost losing her. In the chaos of the storm, the barriers of propriety had washed away. I have you, he said, his voice rough. I will not let you fall. Clara looked at his hands. They were bleeding. The sharp granite had shredded his knuckles when he grabbed her. The blood mixed with the rain, running pink over his skin. Your hands, she said, reaching up to touch his wrist. It is nothing. Jed said. He did not pull away. For a moment, the storm seemed to disappear. There was only the heat of his body near hers, the smell of wet wool and leather, and the absolute certainty that this man would die before he let gravity take her again. Up, Neil commanded, breaking the moment. There is a shelter ahead, an old bear den. They pushed on for another 100 yards until they found the shallow cave. It was dry and smelled of old earth. They huddled inside, out of the wind. Neil sat near the entrance, his rifle across his knees, watching the dark curtain of rain. Jed and Clara sat further back. The rain eventually slowed to a steady drummer's beat. The night was pitch black, save for the occasional flash of distant lightning. Look, Neil said softly. Jed and Clara moved to the mouth of the cave. Neol pointed down into the valley they had left behind. Miles away now, in the distance, a fire was burning. It was not a campfire. It was a bonfire. Massive and angry, visible even through the misty air. And around it, they could see the movement of many torches. Is that your people? Clara asked Niall hopefully. Niall shook his head. No, my people build small fires. That is a white man's fire, a fire of war. Jed squinted into the dark. That is not a posse, he said, his voice grim. There are too many lights. Silas has emptied the saloons. He has hired every drifter and gunman within 50 miles. He is sweeping the mountain, Neil said. He is not trying to catch a fugitive anymore. Jed realized he is starting a war to cover a murder. Clara pulled Jed's coat tighter around herself. The warmth of it was fading, replaced by a chill that came from within. They are coming for us. Let them come, Neil said, though his hand tightened on his rifle. Jed looked at Clara, then at the distant fire. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the box of ammunition he had bought at the store what felt like a lifetime ago. He took out a single cartridge and rolled it between his bleeding fingers. "They are coming," Jed agreed. "And this time, throwing rocks will not be enough." He looked at his gun, the useless hammer mocking him. He slipped the cartridge into his pocket. The oath he had sworn to keep the peace was weighing heavy against the promise he had just made to keep Clara alive. And looking at the fire below, he knew that soon he would have to choose which promise to break. The storm had washed the dust from the air, leaving the morning sky a piercing, unforgiving blue. But down in the canyon, the mood was anything but bright. The reality of their situation sat between them like a cold stone. They could run to the ends of the territory, but unless the truth was heard, they would be hunted until they were dead. "We cannot outrun the telegraph," Jed said, breaking the silence of the cave. He was checking the cinch on the stolen horse they had managed to acquire during the night, a sturdy roan mare liberated from a sleeping prospector, with a promise written on a scrap of bark to return her. "Silas will wire his friends in Helena. Every marshal from here to the border will be looking for a woman with a ledger and a cowboy with a broken gun." Clara sat by the dying embers of their small fire, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "So we go back," she said. It was not a question. "We go back," Neil agreed, cleaning his rifle. "But not to fight with bullets. We fight with the paper." "The circuit judge arrives in Sweetwater Crossing tomorrow," Clara said, remembering the schedule she had posted in the mercantile window herself. "Judge Holloway. He is a hard man, but he is federal. Silas cannot buy him." "Silas will keep you from reaching him," Jed warned. "He has the town locked down." "Not the whole town," Neil said. He looked at Clara. "You know the man who heals the one with the shaking hands?" "Dr. Thorne?" Clara asked. "Elias Thorne. He is the town drunk. Niall. He has not practiced medicine since the war. He drinks to forget the screaming," Neil said solemnly. "But he remembers the silence. He was there 5 years ago, when the first survey was done. He saw the army push my people back. He signed the death certificates for the ones who did not move fast enough. He knows where the bodies are buried because he held the shovel." Clara's eyes widened. "If Dr. Thorne testifies, if he corroborates the map, then Silas Crow hangs," Jed finished. The plan was madness, born of desperation. They would ride back into the lion's den right under the nose of the man who wanted them dead. They reached the outskirts of Sweetwater Crossing just as the sun began to dip, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the scrubland. The town was on edge. They could feel it even from the perimeter. Men were patrolling the streets in groups of 3, carrying shotguns. "I go to the doctor," Neil whispered. "I will bring him to the meeting place." "The mercantile," Clara said. "The back storeroom. It has a heavy lock and only 2 keys. I have one. The owner, Mr. Henderson, is deaf in one ear and sleeps like the dead upstairs. We can meet there." "It is too dangerous for you to walk the street," Jed argued, gripping her arm. "They are looking for Clara the bookkeeper," she replied, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a faded sunbonnet she had scavenged and a rough woolen shawl. She rubbed dirt onto her cheeks and darkened her eyebrows with charcoal from the fire. "They are not looking for a farm wife coming to buy supplies before the storm breaks again." Jed looked at her. Under the grime and the rough clothes, she looked smaller, frailer, but her eyes were steel. "I will be right behind you," Jed said. "If anyone touches you, the oath ends." Clara walked into town, her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. She kept her head down, affecting the rolling, tired gait of a woman who had spent too many years walking behind a plow. She passed 2 men Silas had hired. They were leaning against a hitching post, smoking. "Have you seen anything?" one asked. "Just dust and jackrabbits," the other spat. They barely glanced at the weary woman in the bonnet. Clara held her breath until she was past them. The mercantile was open, though the main lamps were dim. Mr. Henderson was dozing behind the counter. Clara moved to the back, past the rows of canned peaches and bolts of calico. She needed a reason to be there if he woke up. She grabbed a scoop and a small brown paper sack. She moved to the sugar barrels in the rear of the store, near the door to the storeroom. The bell above the main door chimed. Jed entered. He had pulled his hat so low his face was invisible, his coat collar turned up. He moved to the display of horse tack, positioning himself where he could watch the street and the counter. He was the silent sentinel, the shadow in the corner. Clara slipped the key into the storeroom lock. It turned with a soft click. She slipped inside, leaving the door cracked an inch. The storeroom was cool and smelled intensely of molasses, raw grain, and sawdust. It was a smell of safety, of home, and it made her knees weak. She leaned back against a stack of 50-pound sugar sacks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The terror of the last 2 days crashed down on her. The door pushed open. Jed slipped in, closing it softly behind him. "Clara," he whispered. "I am fine," she lied, her voice trembling. I am buying sugar. That is what I am doing, just buying sugar." Jed moved to her. He did not touch her. Not yet. He stood close, his large frame blocking out the fear of the world outside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small paper sack she had filled. He had swiped it from the counter on his way in. "You forgot this," he said softly. He held it out, but instead of handing it to her, he reached into his other pocket. He pulled out a small object attached to a leather thong. It was a piece of wood, no larger than a walnut. It was carved from dark ironwood, polished smooth by hours of patient rubbing. It was a heart, not a crude shape, but a delicate, anatomical heart, with curves and veins rendered with an artist's touch. Clara stared at it. She knew Jed whittled to calm his hands when the memories got too loud, but she had never seen what he made. "I made this a long time ago," Jed said, his voice rough, like gravel grinding under a boot heel. "After the war, after everything." He took her hand, his calloused fingers engulfing hers. He placed the wooden heart in her palm, then curled her fingers over it. "I do not have much to give a woman like you, Clara," he said. "I have a horse that isn't mine, a gun that doesn't shoot, and a past that is darker than this room." He paused, his throat working. He looked at her, his gray eyes raw and open in a way she had never seen. "But this," he touched her fist where the heart lay. "Sweet enough for my virgin?" He stopped. The word hung in the air, heavy and awkward. He took a breath, his ears turning red in the dim light, and corrected himself, his voice dropping to a whisper that was almost a prayer. "Heart?" Clara's breath hitched. "My virgin heart?" He was telling her that despite his age, despite the violence he had seen, the part of him that could love had never been touched. It had been locked away, safe and untouched, until she had pried open the door with a ledger book and a desperate plea. She did not kiss him. To kiss him now would be to rush a moment that needed to be savored. Instead, she took the wooden heart and pressed it flat against his chest, right over his beating heart. She pressed her hand over his, trapping the wood between their bodies. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the gloom. "It is perfect," she whispered. For a moment, in the dust and the smell of brown sugar, there was no Silas Crow, no bounty, no death. There was only the man who had forgotten how to live, and the woman who was teaching him how to start again. A soft knock at the back-loading door shattered the moment. Jed spun, placing himself between Clara and the door. He drew his revolver. "Open!" a voice hissed. "It is the healer." Jed unbolted the door. Neil slipped in, supporting a man who looked like a stiff wind would blow him over. Dr. Elias Thorne was a scarecrow of a man, his suit coat shiny with age, his white hair wild. He smelled of gin, but his eyes were surprisingly clear. "You are the girl," Dr. Thorne said, looking at Clara. "The one causing all this trouble. I am the one trying to stop it." "Doctor," Clara said, stepping forward. "Do you remember the survey of '85? Thorne laughed, a bitter, hacking sound. "I drink a quart of gin a day to forget it, my dear, but some ghosts do not drown." "We have the map," Neil said. We have the proof. We need you to say it is real. Silas will kill me, Thorne said, his hands shaking. Silas is already killing the town, Clara said. He is poisoning it with fear. If you do not speak, the silence will kill you anyway. Thorne looked at her, then at Niall. He sighed, a long, deflating sound. I kept a journal, he admitted softly. I noted the coordinates. I noted the names of the families he pushed out. It is in the church, hidden in the pastor's donation box. I thought maybe God would forgive me if I left it in his house. We need that journal, Jed said. Pastor Miller has it, Thorne said. He is meeting us here. Neil sent word, as if summoned. The loading door creaked again. A short, stout man in a black coat hurried in. It was Pastor Miller, clutching a heavy, leather-bound book to his chest. I found it, the pastor gasped, wiping sweat from his bald head. And I found something else, a letter tucked inside the cover. It is from Silas to the Railroad Consortium. It details the payment for the arson services regarding the warehouse fire 2 days ago. He hired men to burn his own warehouse? Jed asked, incredulous. To blame the tribe, Neil said, his voice cold. To create an enemy. Clara took the letter. It was damning. Combined with the map and Thorne's testimony, it was enough to hang Silas Crow 3 times over. We have it, Clara said, a smile breaking through her fear. We have everything. Then we move, Jed said. The judge is at the courthouse tomorrow morning. We wait here until dawn. Then we walk out together. But fate and Silas Crow had a different timeline. Hey! A rough voice shouted from the alleyway outside. I saw a light under the door open up. The group froze. It is the patrol, Thorne whispered, terrified. Open the door or we burn you out, the voice roared. It was the laborer again, the one Jed had humiliated at the creek. Jed shoved the heavy bolt home just as a shoulder slammed against the wood. Block it, he yelled. Neil and Jed threw their weight against the stacks of sugar sacks, pushing them in front of the door. Fire! Someone screamed outside. They're in the warehouse! Burn it down! The smell of kerosene hit them a second later, sharp and chemical. Then came the whoosh of ignition. The dry wood of the warehouse walls caught instantly. Flames licked up the sides of the building, visible through the cracks in the planks. The front! Clara yelled. She ran toward the door leading to the main store, but it was locked from the outside. Mr. Henderson must have woken up and locked it in panic. Or worse, Silas's men had secured it. Smoke began to fill the room thick, black, choking smoke. It billowed from the burning walls, swirling around the sacks of flour and sugar. We are trapped, Thorne coughed, sinking to his knees. The roof, Neil shouted. The skylight. He pointed to a small, glass-paned hatch 20 feet up in the darkness. Jed, boost me, Neil commanded. Jed laced his fingers together. Neil stepped into his hands and launched himself upward, catching the rafter beam. He swung up with the grace of a mountain cat, smashing the glass with the butt of his rifle. Climb! Neil yelled down, lowering a rope he had uncoiled from his waist. The heat was becoming unbearable. The sacks of sugar were melting, the molasses bubbling and turning into scalding caramel. Clara first, Jed shouted. He tied the rope around her waist. Go! Neil hauled her up. She scrambled onto the beam, coughing violently, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Thorne! Clara screamed. Jed grabbed the old doctor, practically throwing him at the rope. Neil pulled him up, his muscles straining. The fire had eaten through the back wall. The door collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris across the room. 2 men rushed in through the flames, bandanas over their faces, guns drawn. Jed was the last one on the floor. He grabbed the rope. There he is, one of the gunmen shouted. He raised his pistol. Neil, perched on the beam, did not hesitate. He swung his rifle down and fired. The gunman's pistol flew from his hand as the bullet struck the metal. Go, Jed! Neil roared. Jed climbed, hand over hand, his strength fueled by desperation. A second shot rang out from below. Jed felt the wind of the bullet pass his ear. He reached the beam. Neil grabbed his jacket and hauled him onto the roof just as the floor of the warehouse disappeared into a cauldron of fire. They scrambled across the tar paper roof, coughing, their eyes stinging. The town below was in chaos. People were running with buckets, shouting. The fire was spreading fast. "There!" a voice shouted from the street. "On the roof!" Silas Crow stood in the middle of the street, illuminated by the orange glow of the inferno. He held a Winchester repeater. He raised it calmly and fired. Neil grunted. Spinning around, he collapsed onto the roof, clutching his left shoulder. "Neil!" Clara screamed. Crawling to him, blood was welling up between his fingers, dark and slick against his buckskin shirt. "It is just a scratch," Neil gritted out, though his face was gray with pain. "Keep moving. The alley side. Jump to the stable." Jed grabbed Neil's good arm, hauling him up. "I have got you, brother." They ran to the edge of the roof. It was a 6-foot gap to the hayloft of the livery stable. "Jump," Jed commanded. They leaped. For a terrifying second, they were suspended over the alleyway, silhouetted against the flames. They landed hard in the hay, rolling to absorb the impact. "They are in the stable," Silas roared outside. "Surround it." They were cornered, trapped in a wooden barn with a wounded man and an elderly drunk, while an army of hired guns circled them. Clara looked at Jed. His face was soot-stained, his eyebrows singed. He looked at the doctor, who was clutching the ledger book as if it were a shield. He looked at Niall, who was binding his own wound with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. "We cannot run anymore," Jed said, his voice strangely calm. "No," Clara said. She stood up, brushing the hay from her skirt. She checked her bodice. The map was still there. "We do not run." She walked to the loft doors and threw them open. Below, the square was filled with people. Not just Silas's men, but the townsfolk, the blacksmith, the baker, the wives and children woken by the fire. They were staring at the burning warehouse, their faces illuminated by the destruction. Silas Crow stood at the front, his rifle raised. "Come down! Win!" Silas shouted. "Come down and die like the traitor you are!" Clara stepped out onto the loading platform of the loft, high above the crowd. The firelight caught her hair, turning it into a halo of copper. She did not look like a fugitive. She looked like an avenging angel. "I am coming down! Silas!" she shouted, her voice ringing clear over the roar of the fire. "But I am not coming alone, and I am not going to die." She turned back to the shadows of the loft. "Ready?" she asked. Jed stepped up beside her, supporting Niall. Dr. Thorne stood on her other side, clutching his book. "Ready?" Jed said. He checked his gun. It was still empty, still broken. But his heart, the one she had touched in the sugar room, was full. "Then let us go to court," Clara said. They descended the ladder, not into the shadows, but right into the center of the town square. They walked straight toward the courthouse steps, ignoring the guns pointed at them, ignoring the flames. The rising action was over. The climax had arrived. The heat from the burning warehouse was a physical force, pushing against their backs as they marched into the town square. But the heat coming from the gathering crowd was far more dangerous. The fire had done its work. It had acted as a beacon, drawing every soul in Sweetwater Crossing out of their beds and saloons. They formed a semicircle around the courthouse steps, a restless ocean of angry faces illuminated by the flickering orange light of destruction. Silas Crow stood at the base of the steps, his chest heaving, soot smudged across his cheek. He looked like a general rallying his troops, pointing a finger at the 4 figures emerging from the smoke. "There they are," Silas bellowed, his voice raw. "The arsonists! They burned the stores to cover their theft. Take them!" The crowd surged forward, a collective growl rising from their throats. "Hold!" The command cracked like a whip, echoing off the wooden facades of the main street. Judge Halloway stood on the top step of the courthouse porch. He was a man of 60, with a mane of white hair and the imposing bulk of a grizzly bear. He wore his nightshirt tucked hastily into trousers, with a heavy frock coat thrown over the top, but he held a gavel in one hand and a shotgun in the other. This is a federal courthouse. Silas Crow, the judge boomed. And I will not have a lynching on my porch while I am sitting in residence. Step back. The crowd hesitated. The authority of the federal bench still held a sliver of power, even here on the edge of the wilderness. Clara Wynne stepped forward. Her dress was torn at the hem, her face streaked with ash and sweat, but she held her head high. She walked past Silas, ignoring the murderous look in his eyes, and climbed the first 3 steps until she stood above the mob. "We did not set the fire," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, cutting through the murmuring like a bell. "We survived it." "Lies," Silas shouted. "She is in league with the tribe. She is stealing land deeds." "I am stealing nothing," Clara replied. Reaching into her bodice, she pulled out the packet of papers. They were bent and warm from her body, but intact. "I am returning what was stolen." She opened the ledger page, holding it up so the firelight illuminated the seal. "This is the water rights survey for the Southern Valley," she stated, her tone shifting from defense to the precise, factual cadence of a bookkeeper. Dated August 1885. It clearly marks the creek and the surrounding 300 acres as protected territory, designated for the usage of the indigenous tribes and existing homesteads. She flipped the page. "And this," she continued, "is the transfer deed Silas Crow attempted to file last week. It claims the land is uninhabited scrub. It bears the signature of Governor Warren. But look closely." She pointed to the bottom of the page. "Governor Warren is left-handed. The ink flow on this signature leans to the right, and the date of the signature is the 12th of July. Governor Warren was in Washington City on the 12th of July lobbying for statehood." A murmur went through the front row of the crowd. These were men who dealt in cattle sales and land claims. They understood the language of contracts. "She forged it herself!" Silas screamed, his hand drifting toward his holster. "She is a witch with a pen!" "I saw the order given." Jed Callahan stepped up beside Clara. He did not look at the crowd. He looked straight at the men he had worked beside for 5 years. The ranch hands, the fence menders. "You know me," Jed said, his voice rough gravel. "I have ridden the fence with most of you. I have pulled your calves out of the mud. I was a scout for the army before I came here." He took a breath, the confession sitting heavy on his tongue. "I was there when the first village was burned in the north." Jed said, "I saw written orders turn into verbal orders, and verbal orders turn into ashes. I stood by and did nothing because I was following the chain of command. I have carried that silence for 5 years." He looked at Silas. "I am done being silent. I saw Silas Crow pay the men who set the fire tonight. I saw him hand a bag of silver to Pike Miller behind the livery stable 2 days ago." He pointed to the hulking laborer in the front row, the man who had jeered at the girl in the warehouse. Pike shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Jed's gaze. "And you trust him," Silas sneered. "A broken cowboy who is too scared to load his own gun. He is a coward. The land does not know cowardice." A deep voice resonated. Neil stepped forward. He was bleeding. The dark stain on his shoulder had spread, soaking his buckskin shirt, but he stood with the posture of a king. The crowd recoiled slightly. To see a warrior standing armed on the courthouse steps was a sight that triggered their deepest, most primal fears. "You look at me and you see an enemy," Neil said. He did not shout. He spoke to the earth, and the earth seemed to amplify his voice. "But when the drought comes, does the rain ask if you are white or red when the blizzard strikes? Does the snow spare your cattle because you built a fence?" He looked at the faces of the farmers. "Silas Crow wants the water. He will dam the creek. He will sell the water to you in barrels, water that God gave to the valley for free. If you let him take my land today, he will take your farm tomorrow. A wolf does not stop eating because he is full. He eats until there is nothing left." The logic struck home. The farmers exchanged worried glances. The hatred was still there, but the greed, the fear of losing their own stake was stronger. "Enough of this sermon," Silas roared. He turned to the crowd, sensing his grip slipping. "They are lying to save their skins. Burn them, burn the papers. I have the bullet." The shout came from the side. Dr. Elias Thorne hobbled up the steps, supported by the pastor. The doctor was pale, shaking with withdrawal, but he held a pair of forceps in his hand. "I removed this bullet from the leg of the surveyor found dead last month," Dr. Thorne announced, his voice cracking. "Silas said it was a tribal arrow, but I found lead." He held up the small, deformed piece of metal. "And I removed this bullet," Thorne continued, holding up a second slug, "from the wall of the mercantile just now, where Silas Crow fired at these people." He brought the two pieces of metal together. "30-30 caliber," the doctor said, "from a modified Winchester repeater with a field extractor. A distinctive scratch on the casing. The same gun, the same killer." The silence that followed was absolute. The evidence was technical, precise, and damning. Silas Crow's face twisted. The mask of the lawman fell away, revealing the cornered animal beneath. "Kill them!" Silas screamed, drawing his revolver. $5,000 to the man who kills the witness." Money spoke louder than justice. 5 or 6 of Silas's hired guns, men with nothing to lose, pulled their weapons. "Get down!" Jed yelled. He shoved Clara behind the thick oak pillar of the courthouse porch. The square erupted into chaos. A gunshot shattered the lantern hanging above the door. Splinters of wood exploded from the steps. "Protect the evidence," Neil shouted. He did not fire his rifle. There were too many innocents in the crowd. Instead, he swung the weapon like a club. He vaulted off the steps, crashing into the first gunman who tried to rush the porch. Neil moved with a fluid, brutal efficiency, striking the man's wrist to break the hold on the gun, then driving his knee into the man's stomach. Jed stood before Clara, a human shield. A man in a duster coat charged up the stairs, leveling a shotgun. Jed drew his Colt. He knew it wouldn't fire. He knew it was a bluff, but he had to make it count. He leveled the empty gun right between the man's eyes and pulled back the hammer. The metallic click was lost in the noise, but the visual was terrifying. The gunman flinched, jerking the shotgun trigger prematurely. The buckshot went wild, tearing into the roof. Before the man could rack the slide for a second shot, Jed stepped in. He pistol-whipped the man across the jaw with the heavy steel barrel of the Colt. The man crumpled. "Don't let them take the papers," Jed roared, kicking the shotgun down the stairs. But Silas was not fighting the men. He was going for the source. Silas lunged through the melee, scrambling up the side of the porch. He grabbed Clara by her hair, yanking her backward. Clara screamed, the sound tearing at Jed's heart. She fell hard against the railing, but she curled her body around the ledger book, clutching it to her chest with a death grip. "Give it to me," Silas snarled, striking her across the face with the back of his hand. "No," Clara gasped, spitting blood. Jed turned, his eyes going wide. He was 10 feet away, separated by 2 brawling men. He couldn't shoot. He couldn't reach her. "Neil!" Jed screamed. The warrior was engaged with 2 men at the bottom of the steps. He heard the call. He looked up. He saw Silas raising his gun to pistol-whip Clara again, a blow that could crack her skull. Niall did not hesitate. He drew the hunting knife from his belt and threw it. It was a desperate throw, uphill and through smoke. The knife did not hit Silas in the heart. It buried itself in the meat of his shoulder, the gun arm. Silas howled, dropping his revolver. He staggered back, releasing Clara's hair. Jed was there a second later. He didn't use his gun. He tackled Silas, driving his shoulder into the bounty hunter's gut. They crashed through the railing, tumbling off the porch and into the dirt below. They rolled in the dust, punching and gouging. Silas was stronger, heavier, fueled by rage. He got on top of Jed, his hands closing around Jed's throat. "I will kill you, Cowboy," Silas spat, his thumbs digging into Jed's windpipe. "I will kill you, and then I will burn her." Jed's vision began to spot with black. He couldn't breathe. He clawed at Silas's face, but the grip was iron. Suddenly, the pressure vanished. A rifle butt slammed into the side of Silas's head. It was the judge, Judge Halloway, standing in the dirt in his nightshirt, wielding his shotgun like a club. Silas rolled off, dazed. "Enough," the judge bellowed, leveling the shotgun at Silas's chest. "I said this is a federal court." The gunshot had stopped the brawling. The hired guns looked around. Seeing their leader down and a federal judge ready to execute him, Clara stood up on the broken porch. Her lip was split, bleeding down her chin. Her hair was a wild tangle. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. But in her hand, raised high above her head like a torch, was the ledger. "Look at me!" Clara screamed at the crowd. Her voice was raw, filled with the fury of a woman who had been hunted, threatened, and beaten. The crowd fell silent. The only sound was the crackling of the distant fire. "You want to kill us?" Clara challenged, shaking the papers. "You want to kill us for $5,000? Then do it, but know what you are killing for." She pointed a trembling finger at Silas, who was groaning in the dirt. "You are killing for a liar. You are killing for a thief who would burn your homes just as easily as he burned the warehouse, if it made him a profit." She stepped to the edge of the broken railing. She looked straight at the men who had held guns a moment ago. "If you want to hang me," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried across the square, "then hang me for the truth. Do not hang me for his lies." She stood there, small and broken and magnificent. Pike Miller, the laborer, looked at Clara. He looked at the burning warehouse where he had almost killed a woman and an old man. He looked at Silas, bleeding and defeated. Pike dropped his gun. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. I didn't sign up for this," Pike stammered. "He said they were spies. He didn't say anything about killing the doc." "He paid you, Pike!" Jed rasped, standing up and wiping blood from his mouth. "Tell the judge. He paid you to light the match." Pike looked at the judge's shotgun. "He gave me $10, Pike admitted, his voice small. "He told me to burn the back door so they couldn't get out." The confession hung in the air. Attempted murder. "Arrest him," Judge Holloway commanded. The town marshal's deputies, who had been conspicuously absent until the tide turned, finally moved in. They hauled Silas Crow to his feet. He spat at Jed, but the fight had gone out of him. He was a bully who only fought when the odds were stacked in his favor. "This isn't over," Silas shouted as they dragged him toward the jail. "The consortium owns this territory. You cannot stop the future." "I am the future, Silas," Clara said softly, watching him go. "And the future has a long memory." The crowd began to disperse, the adrenaline fading into shame. They looked at their boots, avoiding the eyes of the three people standing on the steps. Neil sat on the bottom step, pressing a cloth to his shoulder. Jed limped over to him. "You threw a good knife," Jed said, offering a hand. "You make a good distraction." Neil grunted, taking the hand. Jed pulled him up. There was blood on both of them, but the animosity was gone. They were blood brothers now, forged in the fire. Clara came down the stairs. She still clutched the papers, her knuckles white. She looked at Jed. His lip was swollen, his eye bruised. "You are hurt," she said. "I have had worse," Jed said. He reached out, gently touching the bruise forming on her cheek. "But you were the bravest thing I ever saw. Clara Wynne." Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 days. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "Is it over?" she asked. "The fighting is over," Jed said, looking at the eastern sky where a faint line of gray was heralding the dawn. "Now comes the hard part." "What is that?" Neil asked. "Living with it," Jed replied. He put his arm around Clara, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't check the exits. He didn't look for a threat. He just stood there, holding the woman who had bought a pound of sugar and ended up buying his soul back from the dark. The climax had passed. The storm had broken. Now, they just had to pick up the pieces. The sun that rose over Sweetwater Crossing the morning after the riot was pale and watery, filtered through the lingering haze of smoke that hung above the charred ruins of the warehouse. The fire had been extinguished, but the scar it left on the town was black and ugly, a gaping hole in the row of false front buildings that mirrored the divide in the community itself. The town did not wake up absolved. There was no miraculous washing away of sins. As Clara Wynne walked down the boardwalk toward the Mercantile, she did not meet the eyes of friends or neighbors. Instead, She met backs turned in sudden fascination with shop windows, or heads bowed low over tasks that did not need doing. The men who had screamed for her blood the night before, fueled by Silas Crow's whiskey and lies, now shuffled about in the daylight. Ashamed not of their hatred, but of their exposure. They had been seen. The darkness in their hearts had been dragged out into the town square and illuminated by the fire, and now they could not look at the woman who had held the mirror. Clara reached the mercantile. The front door was unlocked, though the smell of wet ash and ruined sugar was overpowering. She stepped inside. Mr. Henderson was sweeping the floor. He was a man of 50, usually jovial, with a face that turned red when he laughed. He was not laughing now. He looked up as the bell chimed, and his face went slack with a mixture of relief and dread. "Clara," he said, leaning on his broom. He did not come around the counter to greet her. "Mr. Henderson," Clara said, smoothing her torn dress. "I came to see about the ledger, and to help clean up." Henderson sighed, a sound that rattled in his chest. He looked at the blackened wall where the storeroom door used to be. "The ledger is safe, thanks to you. And the judge, well, the judge has taken the papers into federal custody. He is sending them to the territorial capital by armed courier at noon." "That is good news," Clara said. "Then Silas cannot touch them." "Silas is in irons," Henderson said, his voice dropping. "But Silas was just a hand. Clara, the arm that held him, that arm is long. And it is rich." He paused, looking down at his boots. "I cannot keep you on. Clara." Clara felt a coldness settle in her stomach, distinct from the fear of the last few days. It was the coldness of rejection. "I saved your store. Mr. Henderson, I saved the evidence that proves the land grab was illegal." "I know," Henderson said miserably. "And you are a hero to the judge and the preacher. But to the men who buy my flour, to the men who owe money to the bank that Silas represented, you are a trouble magnet. If I keep you, they will boycott me. Or worse, the next fire will not start in the back. It will start in my bedroom." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of coins. "Here's your wages for the week, plus $2 extra. Please take it. And please, go." Clara looked at the money. $2. The price of her loyalty. She did not take it. "Keep your money, Mr. Henderson," she said softly. "You will need it to buy a new conscience." She turned and walked out. She stood on the boardwalk, the wind tugging at her skirts. She had no job. She had no room at the boarding house, which had made it clear she was no longer welcome. She was a woman who had spoken the truth, and in the West, the truth often left you standing alone in the street. She walked to the edge of town, to an abandoned line shack near the livery stable where Jed had taken Niall. It was a poor shelter, with gaps in the walls and a dirt floor, but it was away from the staring eyes. Inside, the light was dim. Neil sat on a crate, stripped to the waist. His left shoulder was a mess of bruised flesh and dried blood where Silas's bullet had grazed him. It was a deep furrow, ugly and angry, but it had missed the bone. Jed Callahan was boiling water over a small spirit stove in the corner. He looked up as Clara entered. His lip was swollen, split down the middle, and his left eye was a shade of deep violet. He looked like a man who had gone 10 rounds with a thresher, but his eyes were clear. "Henderson fired you," Jed said. It was a statement, not a question. "He gave me $2 to leave," Clara said, putting down her bag. "I left the money?" "He is a frightened man," Neil said, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Fear makes men small." "Sit still," Clara commanded gently. She went to the basin of water Jed had prepared. She tore a strip of clean white cloth from her petticoat, the only clean thing she had left. "I need to clean that wound before the fever takes you." She knelt beside the warrior. Neil watched her. In the town, a white woman touching an indigenous man would be cause for a lynching. Here, in the quiet dust of the shack, it was simply necessary. Clara dipped the cloth in the hot water. She cleaned the wound with steady, precise hands. Neil did not make a sound, though his muscles bunched under his copper skin. "The judge has the papers," Clara told them as she worked. He is sending them to the capital. Paper is slow, Neil said. Greed is fast. The men who pay Silas will know by tomorrow. Let them know, Jed said from the corner. He was sitting on an overturned saddle, his Colt revolver dismantled on his lap. The pieces were laid out on a rag, the cylinder, the barrel, the frame, and a tiny metal pin. Clara finished tying the bandage. She looked at Jed. What are you doing? Jed picked up the firing pin. For 5 years, he had carried the gun without it. It had been his penance, his promise to the universe that he would never again be an instrument of death. The world is not what I wanted it to be. Clara, Jed said quietly. He held the pin up to the light. I wanted a world where I could put down the sword and just be a man. But I learned something last night. If good men put down their swords, the wolves do not stop eating. They just eat the sheep faster. He slid the firing pin back into the hammer assembly. It clicked into place with a sound that seemed loud in the small room. He reassembled the weapon with the blind familiarity of a master craftsman. He spun the cylinder. This time, when he dry-fired it, there was a sharp, distinct snap of metal striking metal. You are going to fight? Clara asked, a tremor in her voice. No, Jed said. He holstered the gun. I am going to protect. There is a difference. I will never pull this trigger in anger again. I will never pull it for money or for pride, but I will pull it to keep the breath in your body. Clara, and yours. Neil. Neil looked at the cowboy. He nodded slowly. A warrior does not love the fight. Jed Callahan, he loves what he protects. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a solemn understanding. They were 3 outcasts, bound together by a single night of fire. As evening fell, the wind died down. They had no money for a saloon meal, and they would not have been served anyway. Jed had scavenged some supplies from his saddlebags, a tin of beans, some dried cornbread, and a packet of tea. They sat on the floor of the shack, eating from tin plates. It was the humblest meal Clara had ever eaten. The beans were lukewarm, and the cornbread was stale, but it tasted better than any banquet. It tasted of survival. Jed poured the tea into 3 battered tin cups. It was dark and bitter, and boiled too long. Clara reached into her pocket. She pulled out the small paper sack of sugar she had bought in the mercantile, the sack that had been the pretext for their entire plan. Miraculously, it had survived the fire and the jump from the roof. She opened it. She took a pinch of the brown crystals and dropped them into Niall's cup. Then she took a pinch for herself. Finally, she turned to Jed. He was watching her over the rim of his cup, his eyes soft in the flickering light of the spirit stove. Clara took a generous pinch of sugar. She reached out and dropped it into his tea. The crystals swirled and dissolved, vanishing into the dark liquid. For the bitterness, she whispered. Jed took a sip. He closed his eyes, savoring the taste. Sweet, he murmured. Sweet enough. He looked at her, and the reference to his wooden heart hung between them, sweet enough for my virgin heart. Neil finished his tea in one long swallow. He stood up, testing his shoulder. I will watch the horses, he said. The air is still, but the coyotes are always hungry. He picked up his rifle and stepped out into the night, closing the door behind him. It was a gesture of profound grace. He was giving them the room. The silence that followed was thick with unsaid words. Clara sat with her legs tucked under her, the firelight catching the copper highlights in her hair. Jed set his cup down and moved closer. He did not grab her. He did not pull her into a cinematic embrace. He simply reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused from years of rope and leather, scarred from the rocks of the canyon. Her hand was smaller, ink-stained, but strong. I have nothing to offer you, Clara, Jed said, his voice husky. No job. Oh. No ranch, just a horse and a reputation that is about to get a lot worse before it gets better. I am not looking for a ranch. Jed? Clara replied. She lifted his hand and pressed it to her cheek. I spent my whole life counting other people's money and writing down other people's lives in books. I want to write my own now. "And what does that story look like?" he asked. "It looks like this," she said. She leaned forward. He met her. They did not kiss immediately. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. They breathed together, sharing the same air, the same relief. It was an intimacy far deeper than physical passion. It was the acknowledgement that they were two broken pieces that had found their match. When he finally kissed her, it was slow and tentative, terrified of breaking the moment. He tasted bitter tea and smoke. She tasted sugar and rain. "Stay with me," Jed whispered against her lips. "I do not know where we are going, but stay with me." "I am not going anywhere," Clara promised. She rested her head on his shoulder, her hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart beneath the heavy cotton shirt. "I bought the sugar. Jed, now I have to stay for the coffee." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest, and pulled her closer. For the first time in years, the cowboy slept without one eye open. The peace lasted exactly until dawn. The morning sky was not greeted by the sun, but by a pillar of black smoke rising from the north. It was thick and oily, staining the horizon. Neil threw open the door of the shack. "Wake up," he said, his voice sharp. Jed was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his gun. Clara scrambled up, clutching her shawl. "What is it?" Jed asked. "Fire," Neil said, pointing north. "At the double bar." Jed's face went pale. The double bar was the ranch where he had worked. It was where the bunkhouse stood, where the few men who had treated him with decency lived. "Retaliation," Jed breathed. "Silas is in jail," Clara said, horror dawning on her. "Silas is just the hand," Jed repeated Henderson's words. "The head is still out there. The consortium. They are burning the range to show the town what happens when you side with the traitors." They ran to the horses. From the ridge behind the town, they could see it clearly. The main barn of the double bar was an inferno. The cattle were scattered, running wild in the sagebrush. "They did this because of me," Clara whispered. "Because I exposed the deed." "No," Jed said firmly. "They did this because they are losing. A winner does not burn the board. A loser does." He turned to her. "We cannot stay here. Clara, Sweetwater Crossing is poison now. If we stay, the town will bleed until they give us up. And I will not let you be the price for their peace." "Where do we go?" Clara asked. "The law is on our side, but the law is far away." Niall looked toward the west, toward the deep mountains where the snow still capped the peaks. "There is a valley," Neil said, "beyond the timberline. It is hard land. The winters are cruel. The white men do not want it because the gold is gone and the grass is short." "Is there water?" Jed asked. "There is a spring." Neil nodded. "Sweet water, cold and deep." Jed looked at Clara. He saw the soot on her face, the fatigue in her eyes, but he also saw the resolve. She was not a woman made for the town anymore. She had outgrown the ledger. "We build," Jed said. "We go where they cannot follow easily. We built a cabin, we planted a garden, and we wait for the law to catch up to the thieves." "It will be hard," Clara said, looking at her soft hands. "It will be ours," Jed corrected. They packed what little they had. It took less than 10 minutes. They had no furniture, no china, no linens. They had a rifle, a revolver, a bag of sugar, and the clothes on their backs. As they drove out of Sweetwater Crossing, they did not look back. The town was waking up to the sight of the burning ranch, to the realization that their silence had bought them nothing but more destruction. They rode past the courthouse, where Silas Crow sat in a cell, plotting a revenge he would never get to execute. They rode past the mercantile, where Mr. Henderson swept the glass from his sidewalk, a smaller man than he had been yesterday. They hit the open trail, the wind drying the sweat on their necks. Neil rode point, his figure cutting a sharp silhouette against the vast sky. Jed rode beside Clara. "Are you afraid?" Jed asked as the town disappeared behind a rise in the land. Clara touched the wooden heart that now hung on a leather thong around her neck, resting against her skin. "No," she said, and she was surprised to find it was the truth. "I am not afraid. I am just beginning." Jed smiled, and this time, it reached his eyes. He spurred his horse forward, leading her away from the smoke and into the clean, sharp air of the high country. They were leaving the falling action behind. They were riding toward the resolution, toward a life that would be hard and cold and dangerous, but it would be sweet enough. The winter snows had melted from the lower passes, retreating to the highest peaks of the Sawtooth Range like a defeated army, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and raw. Up here, in the high valley that the maps merely designated as unsurveyed tract number 9, the air was thin and tasted of pine resin and cold stone. It was a hard place, a place where the wind did not ask for permission before rattling the shutters. But it was their place. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking the creek, the same creek that fed the valley below. But up here, the water was clear, cold, and free of the taint of politics. The structure was built of rough-hewn lodgepole pine, the logs chinked with a mixture of river clay and dry grass that Jed Callahan and Neil had mixed by hand. It was not a palace. The floor was packed earth covered with braided rugs, and the roof had leaked 3 times before Jed finally figured out the pitch. But to the people who gathered there, it was a castle. Clara Wynne sat at the heavy oak table near the window, the morning light illuminating the pages of a ledger. It was not the mercantile's ledger anymore. It was a simple notebook bound in calfskin, filled with the handwriting of a woman who had decided that words were weapons. Across from her sat a man named Elias Vance. He was a sheep farmer, his face weathered like old leather, his hat twisted in anxious hands. "They sent this 3 weeks ago, Miss Clara," Vance said, his voice trembling. He pushed a crumpled piece of paper across the table. "The bank agent said it means I have to vacate by the 1st of the month." "He said I missed the filing date for the grazing permit." Clara smoothed the paper. She adjusted her spectacles, a new pair she had ordered from the catalog, and read the dense, predatory legal language. She read it once, then twice, her eyes narrowing. "The agent is lying, Mr. Vance," Clara said firmly. She picked up her pen, dipping it into the inkwell. "This is a notice of intent to survey, not an eviction order. And look here, at paragraph 4, the grazing rights are grandfathered in for any claim established before 1888. You have been on that land since 86, have you not?" "Since 85, ma'am," Vance said, hope flickering in his eyes. "Then you are not going anywhere," Clara said. She began to write, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "I am drafting a formal response citing the Territorial Homestead Act. You take this to the post office yourself. Do not give it to the agent. Send it registered mail to the land office in Helena." She sanded the ink, blew on it, and folded the paper with a precise, sharp crease. When she handed it to Vance, the old man looked as if she had given him a bar of gold. "I do not know how to thank you," Vance stammered. "I have no money, but I have a ewe that just lambed." "Keep your sheep, Mr. Vance," Clara said with a smile. "Just bring some wool when you shear. The winter will be cold." As Vance left, tipping his hat so many times it nearly fell off, Clara looked out the window. Outside, in the patch of stubborn, rocky soil they had cleared, Jed was working. He was building a trellis for the pole beans. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that had grown even harder over the last year. He was no longer the gunman who scanned every shadow for a threat. He was a builder. He moved with a deliberate, rhythmic peace, driving nails with single, sure strokes. Hanging by the front door, swaying slightly in the breeze, was a small object on a leather thong. It was the wooden heart. The sun and rain had darkened the ironwood, polishing it until it looked almost like stone, but the shape remained true. It was the first thing anyone saw when they approached the cabin, a heart, exposed and unafraid. A shadow fell across the porch. Clara did not jump. She did not reach for a weapon. She simply turned, a smile already forming on her lips. Neil stood in the doorway. He wore a new shirt made of buckskin, decorated with beadwork in the pattern of the running water. He carried a brace of grouse over his shoulder and a sack of pine nuts in his hand. "The sheepman walks with a light step," Neil observed. Stepping inside. You took the weight off his back. I just read the words he could not, Clara said, rising to pour coffee. Words are heavy. Neil, sometimes heavier than stones. And harder to move, Neil agreed. He placed the birds on the counter. I found a patch of wild onions near the south ridge, and the elk are moving down early. It will be a long winter. Neil had not disappeared into the myth of the noble savage or the tragedy of the vanishing race. He had become the anchor that held their small boat steady. He lived in a wigwam 2 miles up the canyon, close enough to see their chimney smoke, far enough to keep his solitude. He was not a third wheel in their romance. He was the axle that let the wheels turn. Is Jed still fighting the beans? Neil asked, a glint of humor in his dark eyes. He says the soil is too alkaline. Clara laughed. He plants them too deep, Neil said, moving to the door. He plants like he is burying a secret. He needs to plant like he is waking a child. I will show him. Clara watched them from the doorway. Niall walked out to the garden patch. He did not lecture. He simply knelt beside Jed, took a handful of earth, and crumbled it. He spoke low, pointing to the sun, then to the creek. Jed listened, nodding. The cowboy who had once ridden fences to keep people out was now learning from the warrior how to let things grow. By evening, the cabin was full. It had started slowly, a trickle of lost souls finding their way up the treacherous trail. First came Widow Gable, the blacksmith's wife from Sweetwater Crossing, who had been ostracized after her husband died of drink and debt. Then came Sarah and Thomas, a couple who'd been driven out of 3 towns because Thomas was black and Sarah was white. Then came the boy, Leo. Leo was 12 years old. He had a limp from a broken leg that had set poorly after his stepfather beat him for giving water to a chain gang of indigenous prisoners. Neil had found him hiding in a cave and brought him to Clara. Now, Leo sat by the fire, whittling a stick, his eyes bright as he listened to Neil tell a story about the coyote and the moon. The cabin was no longer just a home. It was a sanctuary. It was a place where the broken pieces of the frontier came to be mended. Clara moved around the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. The smell of roasting grouse, stewed squash, and cornbread filled the small space. It was a smell of abundance that had nothing to do with money. She reached for the large ceramic jar on the shelf. It was filled to the brim with brown sugar. It was an extravagance, perhaps, given their budget. But it was the one luxury Clara insisted upon. Widow Gable was chopping carrots at the table. She watched Clara scoop a generous amount of sugar into the pot of stewed berries. Lord, Clara, the widow exclaimed gently, you use sugar like it is free. Back in town, you used to measure it out like gold dust. Clara paused, the wooden spoon in her hand. She looked at the jar. She remembered the days in the mercantile, weighing every ounce, recording every penny in the debt book, terrified of being short. She remembered the bitterness of that life, where sweetness was something you bought in small paper sacks and hoarded in the dark. She smiled, and it was a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Back in town, Mrs. Gable, Clara said softly. I bought sugar to survive the day. It was the only sweet thing I had. But now, she gestured to the room, to Jed laughing with Sarah, to Niall showing Leo how to tie a knot, to the warmth of the fire that kept the high country chill at bay. Now, Clara continued, I keep sugar to invite people to stay. Sweetness should be shared, not saved. Dinner was a boisterous affair. There were no prayers for the destruction of enemies, only gratitude for the food. They ate the grouse Niall had hunted, the beans Jed had watered, and the bread Clara had baked. After the meal, the guests retreated to the bunkhouse Jed had built adjacent to the main cabin, a long, low structure meant for anyone who needed a roof for a night or a year. The main cabin grew quiet. The fire burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Neil stood up. The moon is high, he said. I go. Stay, Jed said. The wind is rising. The wind is my brother, Neil said simply. He touched Jed's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood that transcended blood. Then he looked at Clara. "The words you wrote for the sheepman. They were good words." "They were true words," Clara said. Neil nodded. "Truth is the only arrow that flies straight." He slipped out into the night, silent as smoke. Clara and Jed were alone. Clara began to clear the table. Jed stood up and took the plates from her hands. "Leave them," he said. He walked to the door and opened it. The cold air rushed in, crisp and invigorating. He stepped out onto the porch, and Clara followed him. The valley was bathed in starlight. It was a vast, silver bowl of silence. Far below, the creek ribboned through the darkness, a vein of living silver. Jed leaned against the railing he had finished sanding just yesterday. He looked out at the land that no bank owned, land that no railroad claimed. "Silas Crow was transferred to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth yesterday," Jed said quietly. "A writer brought the news while you were working with Vance." Clara felt a momentary chill, the ghost of an old fear. "Is it over, then?" "For him, yes," Jed said. "He will rot in a cell." He turned to look at her. The moonlight softened the angles of his face, erasing the years of hardship, leaving only the man beneath. "But for us," Jed continued, "it is not over. The consortium will send someone else eventually. The winters will be hard. The crops might fail." "You are selling this life very poorly, Mr. Callahan," Clara teased gently, moving to stand beside him. Jed did not smile. He was serious, his gray eyes searching hers. "I am not trying to sell it. Clara, I am trying to ask if you are still buying it." He looked at his hands that had once held a gun with no firing pin, hands that had trembled with the weight of a violent past. Now, they were steady. "Miko bow," Jed said, using a phrase Neol had taught him. "Tomorrow there is a storm. The roof might leak. The road might wash out. Are you still here?" It was not a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense. There was no ring, no kneeling. It was a question of survival. He was asking if she was a fair-weather lover, or if she was rooted in the ground. Clara looked at him. She looked at the man who had ridden into hell to save her, who had put the firing pin back in his gun not to kill, but to keep her safe. She looked at the scar on his lip, the silver in his hair. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart beneath the wool and muscle. "M.O.," she whispered. "I am here. I am not going anywhere. Jed," she said in English, her voice fierce and low. "Let the roof leak. We will fix it. Let the road wash out. We will make a new path. I did not come this far to turn back at the first sign of rain." Jed let out a breath, his shoulders relaxing. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it tighter against his chest. "I never thought I would find this," he admitted hoarsely. "Peace. I thought peace was something you found when you were dead." "Peace is work," Clara said. "It is the hardest work there is." She reached up and touched the wooden heart hanging by the door frame. It swung gently under her fingers. "Do you remember what you said?" she asked. "In the storeroom, when everything was burning." Jed nodded. "I said it was sweet enough for my virgin heart." Clara unhooked the latch of the door, pulling him gently back inside toward the warmth of the fire. She moved to the table where the sugar jar sat, catching the firelight like crushed diamonds. She dipped her finger into the jar, gathering a few grains of sugar. She brought her finger to Jed's lips. He tasted the sweetness, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sugar makes the mouth sweet," Clara said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "It hides the taste of the dust in the bitter tea." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest where the wooden heart had once lain. "But you, Jed Callahan," she whispered into the silence of their home. "You make my life sweet." Jed buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of sagebrush and sugar. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, a wild and untamed song. But inside, everything was still, everything was safe, and everything was sweet enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Clara, Jed, and Niall through the dust and danger of the Wild West. If this story touched you, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If you want to hear more tales of romance, grit, and adventure under the western sky, please make sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support means the world to me and keeps the campfire burning. Thank you, and happy trails.